everybody, let me introduce you. Our next speaker is Shawn Grubb. He is governance leader at Gitcoin, and Shawn will be speaking about Minnows vs. Whales, Quadratic Governance to the rescue. Is it correct?
Yes, Ross, you got it.
Yeah. Sorry, I am without camera. I have a technical issue, but I will be listening to you very carefully. Please go ahead.
Okay, folks, welcome. Glad to have you here today. I know we're getting started a few minutes early, so if you joined right at the bottom of the hour and you missed a few minutes, no worries. You can go back and catch up. I did take and post all of the links, including this presentation, on my Twitter. So if you need to go find me there, you can find me at Shawn L. Grubb. Just find that, or you can also search for Shawn16400. That's my Twitter handle. That's where you can find me and where you can find this presentation and a couple of the other documents we're going to be going through in our discussion today. So with that, we're talking about DAO governance today, Minnows versus the whales, and can quadratic voting bridge the gap? This is going to be a bit of an interesting discussion. Now, when I went back through and I looked at the profile of the people who were joining this discussion, we had people who were deep into DAOs and already members of DAOs. I also saw there were quite a few people that were DAO curious, DAO interested, trying to figure out how to navigate their way through the DAO. So in this presentation, it is geared for the person who's curious, knows something about DAOs, understands it, and as well to those people who are a little bit more experienced and already know some of the problems that we've experienced in this DAO world. So we're going to go through a little bit of the background. We're going to talk about some of the problems we're having, and then I'm going to ladder that up to solving some of the main governance problems that we're having in DAOs today. So with that, let's go ahead and get started. So who am I and why should you care? One of the things that I've noticed in this DAO world is there is a lot of people who have a lot of things to say, and they may not necessarily know what the hell they're talking about. So it's important that whoever you're listening to, make sure you've got an idea of who they are, where they come from, and are they talking about something they've done or something they know about. So to give you that context so that you can get an idea that I've been working in the space for a little bit. Today, I do governance for Gitcoin. Previously, I was working governance communications for Index Co-op, and I've written and researched a ton around governance. Here's a couple of the articles that you can see that I've written, some of the reports that I've pulled together, and recall, if you need to go back and find any of this documentation, you can find it on my Twitter account. I think it's pinned right near the top. Follow the presentation. The presentation includes links to each one of these documents. And so through this, you can see that I've spent a lot of times understanding meta governance, because Index Co-op is the meta governance mecca, right? Invented the concept and leveraged it there. So spent a lot of time going deep on that. And then the past year or so, I've spent trying to understand all the different problems that DAO governance has, right? And we'll get into that in just a little bit. But the key point is here, know who's talking to you, and then get an idea of, do they have an idea what they're talking about, or just do they have a forceful opinion and they're able to articulate that? Because as we know, kind of in this place, is that you got to do your own research. Otherwise, you're going to end up following some Yahoo who's going to end up rug pulling you and taking your money. So why I'm here. I have one goal in working in DAOs and Web3, and that is to solve DAO governance. I know it's a tiny little goal, tiny little thing, but I figure I've got about 5 years to dedicate to this problem. The problem I'm trying to solve is to solve DAO governance, right? Now, DAO governance is a really big issue, and there's a lot of different components to it. So I start right here in the very center of DAO governance. There's a lot of things we need to take into consideration. For example, there's a ton of DAO tools or DAO toolkits that need to be developed. We need to define governance success, principles, after action reviews. How do we critique ourselves? What are the best practices for meta governance? We need a governance risk assessment. There's a bunch of tools that we need to go work on, and there's a lot of work to be done, and we need all the help that we can get in the governance space. Now, going from DAO toolkits to DAO tools. Now, every time I turn around, I see a new tool that pops up. Some of them are collaboration tools. Some of them work great. Some of them got a ways to go. So whether they're talking about Discourse, whether we're talking about Discord, whether we're talking about new tools like Sway, Orca, and I forgot what Orca is now called, Lumio, there's a bunch of different collaboration tools, but then there's also a lot of polling tools that are out there as well. So we need to identify kind of what's the best way to use each one of these tools. There's some governance libraries that we need to invent. And then I've got a whole list of 27 governance problems that I've identified that we need to find a way and go out and solve, right? That's just one side of this mess. The other side of this mess is we're talking about consent mechanisms. Now, consent mechanisms have been around for a long period of time. What's different now is our ability to take that interaction layer to the individual so that each individual can participate in different consent mechanisms. And it's cheap for us to pull one out and try another one. So we're kind of at a unique point in time to where we've got the ability to try many of these different consent mechanisms. And by the way, the one that we're going to be talking about today, I think is in here, right? Someplace. Yes. Quadratic voting. This is just one. So this is one of the consent mechanisms we can talk about. And that's the one we're talking about today. In addition to that, there's a lot of different governance organizations that are popping up, delegation councils, election councils, good governance advocacy councils, which need to be created, research organizations that are dedicated to it. We've got organizational delegates who are starting to pop up, and I think a couple of them are doing a really good job. We've got different news outlets, and then we've got different governance metrics which need to be created. This is one that we kicked off last week where is it here? The Token Decentralization Index. That one I think is going to be interesting. And then there is a ton of legal implications depending upon which particular jurisdiction you're in. So my goal as things that I'm working on and trying to help move the ball a little bit further is this thing called DAO governance. That's my passion area. That's where I'm spending the most amount of my time. And that's why this conversation excites me. There's a ton of things that you can do in this Web3 world. My recommendation is go find something that excites you and go super deep on it. I am excited by a ton of different things. This is one that I've made a very conscious decision that I'm going to go deep on governance, right? So that's another reason why you might want to be listening to me. Today, we're going to talk about 5 different components, right? We're going to step through this conversation, 5 different pieces. First one is we're going to talk about the old world versus the new world, right? And what's different in this DAO world. The second thing we're going to talk about is the difference between the hierarchy and the network. There's lots of conversation about network and networked organizations and how great it is to be in a network. And the reality is networks are great for some things. Hierarchies are great for some things. Let's explore that. Related to that is this thing I call MBA thinking, which is 500 years of business thinking. We've got a lot of expertise and a lot of credibility of the way we've done things in the past. The problem is the way we've done things in the past, if we just reuse the way we've done things in the past, we're going to end up in the same freaking space as we are today. And that's not why I joined a DAO. I didn't join a DAO to create another corporation. I've done that. I don't want to do that. And I don't think you want to do that either. So let's be aware of some of the differences between the old MBA world of thinking, the Masters of Business Masters of Business Administration way of thinking, those people who run our businesses, and the new DAO way of thinking. We're going to talk then with that foundation. We can then talk about voting mechanisms, the 2 major voting mechanisms we have that are in common use today and the problems with those. And then the other piece we're going to end up with is quadratic voting. How can we use this novel mechanism to solve some of the key issues that bubble up from moving from the old world to the new world, understanding the difference between the hierarchy and the network and making sure the network stays strong, juxtaposing the old world of using your MBA thinking to the DAO thinking, and then is this a right mechanism to use for you today? And then we'll also end with the quadratic voting is not the final answer. It is a step, and it is a step that looks like it's going to work well today, and it's a tool. So when is it appropriate to use? So now we do have, I think we have a number of places that we are taking questions. I cannot see any of the questions as they pop up in the chat here. Actually, I take it back. I can see the chat now. I generally tend to ramrod through these presentations and I speak way too fast. However, if I do speak too fast, please put up a note on the chat to tell me to slow down because I get excited and I just keep going. And if you do have a question, please feel free to interrupt me. I'll go ahead and take a moment every now and then and stop for questions because I'm going to go through a lot of content. In addition to that, Ross, you're going to help me out as you're aware of the other streaming mechanisms that we have underway today. If you see any questions pop up either on Telegram, I think it's on Facebook, I think it's in a couple other places, Ross, I'll be looking for your help to field those questions for me. I saw a presentation from my colleague Punkar earlier today, and he had his eye on Telegram at the moment. I don't have that. So Ross, I'll be looking for your help. Okay, so with that, the old way versus the new way. The old way of working is really, I'm going to focus on three pieces. The objective is shareholder wealth. In traditional business, that's the point, shareholder wealth. It's also hierarchical in that decisions are generally handed down, right? And you are not necessarily told what to do. If you're in a really progressive organization, you might have input on what you're doing, but net result is oftentimes someone else is deciding the work that's going to be done, and you're a recipient of that unless you're in general management, right? And then the other piece of this, which is really unique, is knowledge is protected. And that's why we're having this conversation today, because knowledge is not protected. It's shared in this new world. Similarly, the objective is not shareholder returns, but the objective might be stakeholder returns. We'll get into that. Decisions are generally communal and knowledge is shared, which is why this is such a freaking exciting place to be in, because if we share all of our intellectual property, we all get to learn from each other. And as a result of that, we're going to move so much faster. We don't have to wait for the next 500 years to protect DAO life, to perfect DAO life. We can do this in a much shorter period of time, as long as we all commit to share within the network and help each other out, which is why I'm doing this today. And I'm hoping other people will join me on the journey to solve DAO governance. Okay, so there's a ton of differences between the old world of the way of doing business and the new world of way of doing business. And we're not going to go through all of them, right? We don't have time to go through all the different differences. However, I've done that. And I spent a lot of time going through those differences. And the reason why that was interesting to me is I spent 17 years working for a massive multinational corporation, and I ran projects all over the world, and I was that MBA guy. I was that guy who was just sold on Drucker. I read every single one of his books. I was reading all of the latest leadership books. I bought into all of it, and I was that guy. But after about 18 years of that, most of the work that I was doing was selling people, selling plants, selling brands, selling outsourcing, laying people off. And after so many years of that, I'm like, this is enough. I'm done with this, right? I'm not interested in doing this anymore. And at the other side of that, we're doing it for the shareholder, right? And yeah, of course, at that point in time, I'm a shareholder. So I'm like, yeah, okay, I'm helping myself out. But I started to think along the lines, it's like, God, there's got to be something better than this, right? And so eventually through the track has led me toward this DAO direction, right? So as a result of that, I have to watch myself into falling into the traditional world approach, right? I have to be careful because I got a bazillion tools that I can use, pull out of my MBA pocket and use them, and they're not always appropriate. In this conversation, we're going to be focusing on those three: the objective of building shareholder wealth versus delivering stakeholder value, intellectual property is protected versus intellectual property is shared, decisions are top down, and communal, the community decides the decision, which is the exciting piece about this DAO world, because that's different. So let's jump in, starting with the hierarchy versus the network, right? So those of us who come from traditional business, we know well the hierarchy. And in fact, every time I joined a new organization, first thing I did was pull up the org chart and say, okay, who's where do I sit, orient myself, begin to understand who are my peers, who are my colleagues that are higher up, how do I go get to know them, who do I need to know to move things forward, right? That's the hierarchy world. The DAO world is different. I think every time I tried to do, when I first tried to join Index Co-op, when I first tried to join, Gitcoin, my first step was, okay, who's the organization? Let me go find an org chart. And they don't exist. There is no org chart, right? There is no way of understanding initially how the organization has developed, right? And in fact, at some point in time, I did create an org chart, and I got a ton of pushback saying, it's not, I mean, don't do that. That's not what we're supposed to be doing. But the hierarchy does have advantages. For example, if you have a declaration that says, go build and sell 1 million widgets in Q2, right? If that is the declaration and somebody says, go do that, then the hierarchy works extremely well. Everybody lines up and says, sir, yes, sir, I will go build and sell 1 million widgets in Q2. Now, the other side of that is just try to do that in a DAO. I dare you, right? People are first of all going to be like, what? You're telling me what we're going to go do? That doesn't fly in a DAO, right? People want to have input. They want to be pulled along the way. They want to have input to these decisions, and they want to feel valued and heard. Now, is that a clear declarative, right? Is it clear to say, go build and sell 1 million widgets in Q2? I would argue That's pretty darn clear. I mean, I don't know what a widget is. You make it up, but that's pretty clear. I mean, we know what the time frame is, we know what the goal is, and we know what we're supposed to go do, right? That's a pretty clear declarative sentence. What if we change the problem? What if the problem turns into go solve climate change? Holy cow, how do we even do that? How do we think about that? And that's the interesting thing, is that can a hierarchy solve climate change? So, okay, let's try that. Which organization is going to go solve climate change? None. I mean, there's not any one single organization that is going to solve climate change. And that is the idea behind the network. Now, I'm going to take a step back here. There's a book written by a guy by the name of David Ehrlichman. And this is a fascinating book which outlines exactly how to set up something called a network, an impact network. Really good. I mean, it's a play-by-play book, so I really highly recommend it. However, one of the most important components of this book is at the very beginning, helping you to understand exactly what a network is. Now, and I'll draw this out for you. There's 3 different kinds of problems to be solved that, and this is not, I would say it's not unique to Ehrlichman's approach, but he draw it out in his book, and I thought it was helpful. You have simple problems, you have complicated problems, and you have complex problems. The simple problems are clearly defined, understood, and solutions are already present, right? So that is kind of a team effort. You might need a team of people to get together to go solve that problem. For example, build a widget, right? That is a simple problem. We know how to do it. We've done it before. Let's go build a bunch of widgets. You have a team to do that. If I move up the difficulty bar, I move to complicated, which they could be many different moving parts, but they could be defined and understood. An example of that would be go build a widget factory, right? We know how to build a widget. We've done that before. We might have even built a widget factory before, but it's going to take more than just one team to do that, right? You're probably going to need somebody from finance. You're going to need somebody from HR. You're going to need somebody from manufacturing, somebody from design. You're going to need a ton of people. You're going to need somebody to finance it and to pay for it. You're going to need a ton of people to get this thing done, but you can do it. It is possible, right? At the very top level, you've got those complex problems. The complex problems are undefined, ambiguous, and there's no obvious ready solution. There might be a bunch of solutions. We don't really know what they are, right? And so that's it where we run as we move up the difficulty continuum. We move out across the difficulty. We move to what different types of organizations can solve those. Is it a team effort? Is it a multifunctional effort? Or is it potentially a multi-organizational effort? The hierarchy works well in the first domain. The hierarchy works really well if we're going to build a widget or if we're going to go build a widget factory. That's where the hierarchy excels, right? And if you're a DAO building widgets, you don't need to be a DAO. Just go be an organization. Just go build a hierarchy, right? However, if you want to begin solving the really big problems that are facing us today, climate change, poverty, the really difficult, complex problems, you're going to need more than a hierarchy, right? And that's where these DAOs are giving us this space to learn how to do this and to work across many different organizations to be able to solve those complex problems, right? And in reality, many DAOs are still in this place right here, build a widget factory. We're just getting started. I mean, we're 2 years old, year and a half old, 18 months old. We're not that old yet. But if you look at the vision of a lot of these DAOs, they're not here just to solve whatever problems they have on their plate today. They've got bigger pictures, right? And that's what we're trying to solve for. Okay. So let's look back at the hierarchy and let's say you are here. You are one tiny little node in this network. You're one telephone, right? You're one telephone connected to many different telephones. Now, the problem comes with the network is who goes first, right? If the problem is solve climate change, who's in charge, right? Who goes first? Who provides the ideas? Who provides feedback to those ideas? And then who's involved in the decisions and who makes those decisions, right? It's not clear. If you're in a hierarchy, it's the guy above me that does it, right? And if you are the guy above you, it's on you to figure out how to go solve these problems. That's your job, right? That's what you get paid to do. It can be lonely, but we're working in the networked environment is totally different. So this really applies for those people who are coming straight from, say, call it straight from university to DAO world. You don't have to unlearn a bunch of baggage. However, if you're a boomer like me and you're coming from the corporate world into this DAO space, you got a lot of things. There's a lot of things that you need to unlearn, right? Or you need to augment your learning. So who goes first? This whole collection of problems is something called governance, right? Governance solves these problems, or governance attempts to solve and to provide guidance around each one of these components, right? So who goes first, provides the ideas and the feedback. This all evolves through the governance process. Now, the problem is that you're a node, right? And if you're a node in the DAO network, you got to go first, right? It's your ideas that are going to matter, because you can't wait for the guy next to you, because it may not come. You're the node, and it's important for you to go first. It's important for you to provide the ideas, you provide the feedback, and you make the decisions. That's what's different about this world, because this whole governance structure doesn't work without you. That's why if you're in a DAO, you have to participate in governance. It's incredibly important, and it's a great opportunity too. I remember being in the corporate world, and I had a person that was reporting to me, and she was really good. And I was told she was really good. And I think on my first day of her reporting to me, she said, "Shawn, I just want to be told what to do. You tell me what to do and I will go do it." And my mind was like, oh God, this is going to be a headache, because I don't want to tell somebody what to do. I want to tell them, here's a problem, go solve it, right? But she was very directional. She wanted, if I gave her the problem, she would go solve it, right? That's not so easy in the DAO world. There's not a lot of people saying, here's a problem, go solve it. It's a lot of jump in and go figure it out yourself and go find the problem that needs to be solved. You got to be relentless in that approach. That's why governance needs you, and this DAO world is different. Okay, let's talk about this component called MBA thinking. I wrote an entire article about, like, beware of MBA thinking, because it just bit me. And I'll say it's like the typical Jesuit business school says, the point of business is to deliver better than average shareholder returns. And I think I heard that in every single one of my classes for 2.5 or 3 years, right? Go Muskies. Also said another way is maximize your investor returns. Okay, so that's the point. It's just maximize investor returns. And in the corporate world, that's exactly what happened. It's like I was working my butt off to make the shareholders wealthy. Of course, I was a shareholder too, so that's helpful. But that was the point. DAO thinking is somehow different. In your typical DAO, the point of the DAO is to deliver better than average shareholder returns. Now, those are my words, and not every single DAO has that clarity. But most DAOs that you go into, there is something more than just delivering shareholder returns. There's something else in there about what they want to do. Now, if there's not, if the stated objective is basically we want number to go up, and they're calling themselves a DAO, I would probably argue that's probably not the best organizational structure for you. And you're probably wasting a lot of energy and effort trying to recreate a business model that doesn't fit, right? You're calling it a DAO, but it doesn't really need to be a DAO. It could be just a standard business, right? Now, the key difference is here between those two little words, like the shareholder and the stakeholder. And that makes all the difference in the world, because okay, a shareholder is the guy who invests money in the company. He wants to make money, and in traditional business, that's the job, right? The shareholders, they contribute. They're the investors. You got to give them money. The stakeholders are different. Who is a stakeholder? Well, a stakeholder is an investor. An investor is a stakeholder. They have a stake in the success of the company. The customer also has a stake in the success of the company, right? The contributors, they definitely have a stake in the success of the company. And the suppliers, they have a stake in the success of the company. If the DAO goes broke, then, and Llama is providing treasury services, they're going to lose a client, right? In addition to that, the community, right? And finally, the environment. In the DAO, we generally try to look at a broader range of just the shareholder. It's not just the shareholder, it's the stakeholder. And it may not always be articulated this way. And in fact, in most cases, it's not. But the ethos of Web3, I would argue, generally is in this direction. It's not all about the shareholder. It's not all about making some faithless person a bunch of money. It's about improving the returns or delivering value to a larger pool of stakeholders. That's what we're looking for. Now, the problem is that if you're comparing what I call the golden rule, right, which is kind of the MBA world, is the golden rule is he who has the gold makes the rule. That doesn't really work if you're trying to maximize your stakeholder returns. And the reason why it doesn't work is that the golden rule in the MBA world, the shareholder is the king. That's what you're trying to do. It's clear. If the total shareholder return does not go up, you are not winning. That's the job. It's like your job is to drive up the shareholder value, right? And you do that via net outside sales, market share, blah, 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 all those metrics, right? And if that's the only function, if that's a primary function, the customer, the way the customer fits into that is, do I have more, right? The community, does the community really fit into that? The environment, do they fit into that? So that's the point. It's like, yes, there are ESG efforts to say we're gonna take into consider the environment, we're gonna take into consider all these other things. They're kind of secondary. They're secondary to shareholder returns. So the point I'm trying to make here is that you cannot use decision criteria in the decision mechanisms that be built upon MBA thinking. They don't necessarily work so well in the DAO world, because our shareholders, our stakeholders are different than just shareholders. Who we care about and who we care about having a positive return is much broader. So it's a different audience. And I argue that it drastically changes the structure of how we make decisions. Okay. Let's talk about issues with voting mechanisms. This is democracy, right? Democracy says you have a sheep and you got a wolf. And the wolf says, "Can I eat you for dinner?" And the sheep said, "No." And so the wolf pulls his buddy aside and he says, "Well, how about, could we eat you for dinner?" And the sheep says, "Still no." And then he says, "Well, how about if we take a vote?" Right? This indicates something called the tyranny of the majority. Now, I love this example, right? Because it really articulates the one person, one vote problem. The one person, one vote problem is that we're all familiar with the one person, one vote problem. This is how you decide your local elections, your club president, your school board members. Like, one person gets one single vote, and generally it's a binary decision. It's either for or it's against, or you're not voting, right? It's really simple. And usually the first to poll or the majority wins, right? So if this big group of people over here on the left-hand side, if they win, yay. If the guys on the left, they lost, boo, bad for them, right? What about weighted voting? Weighted voting is the other piece that we often see, which we use in business. And weighted voting is shareholder votes, right? Preferred shares. Actually, DeFi does this, and most of our DAOs work this way too, right? Most of our DAOs do use weighted voting. And the weighted voting problem is that you've got a couple people who have got a ton of votes, because one vote equals, or one share equals one vote. So if you got one share, you have one vote. If you've got 100 shares, you get 100 votes. If you've got 1,000,000 shares, you get 1,000,000 votes. And that's what this represents. You got a couple guys who've got millions upon millions of votes. They make the decision, right? So you've got 4 or 5 people, or 10 or 12 or 20 people making a decision, whereas you could have 500 voters, and those 4 or 5 people are making the decision for you, right? That's weighted voting, and that's how most of our DAOs run. And the dirty little secret is, if I look at the DAO, I think the DOW, right? If I look at the New York Stock Exchange, voting on a corporate level is a whole lot more decentralized than voting in many of our DAOs, because we have a ton of whales inside of our DAOs, and a lot of them make the decision. Now, so if you're in that and you're in a DAO and you're like some little guy over here, you're like, what the hell? What am I going to do? So that introduces the issue of the minnow and the whale. Now, the difference between the minnow and the whale here is that the minnow, I mean, they're a contributor, right? They've got 120 tokens, right? And the whale, they might have 1.8 million tokens. They might have 150,000 tokens, right? So this minnow is saying, my vote does not matter. And he is absolutely right. In token weighted voting, if you're a minnow, in most cases, your vote doesn't count at all. In this particular example, which is a DAO I was looking at yesterday, this guy, who is the average minnow, has got 0.08% of the vote compared to the guy that's got 150,000 votes, right? Their vote doesn't matter, right? And that's the problem, because that drives voter apathy, and voter apathy is the DAO governance problem. So if you're trying to fight voter apathy, here's part of the cause, right? And so voter apathy means underrepresentation, it means disenfranchised, and it means disengagement. And do you remember who I said drives governance in the network? You do, right? Which means we need to find a way to draw a line between these two different types of constituents so that we don't lose those minnows, because we need them in the network. Every single node in the network makes the network stronger. So let's go back to DAO thinking. We already agreed that in DAO thinking that we care about the stakeholder returns, and we care about many different constituents in our organization. So the question then comes is, how do we begin to hold the tension between those stakeholders? And primarily here, I'm talking about the minnows and the whales, right? How do we connect those both sides so that both of them feel like there is some sort of representation that is, quote unquote, just, something that's going to keep people engaged in the network and not make them go away. Okay, so this is where we introduce quadratic voting. Quadratic voting is not really all that scary as it sounds, right? And I've got an entire presentation, which I posted on my Twitter profile, which you can go in, and it goes through this discussion. And I'm not going to go through the whole entire piece. I'm going to go through two things. First of all, to make it less scary, remember back to your high school or your secondary education math. What is quadratic? Quadratic is not that complex. What is 1 times 1? It's 1. What is 2 times 2? It's 2. What is 3 times 3? It's 9. 5 times 5 is 25, right? That's just taking the square of some number. The other side of that is, what is the square root of that? So what is the square root of 25? What number times itself equals 25? It's 5. So if I want to take the square of 25, that's equal to 5. If I want to take the square of 16, that's just equal to 4, right? So it's what number times itself gives you that result. That's all quadratic is. So don't let that scare you, right? Okay. What is quadratic voting? So quadratic voting is an idea that was pioneered by Glenn Weil, right? And Glenn is a political economist at Microsoft, and he originally thought of quadratic voting as using a mechanism to flag or to signal the amount that you agree or disagree with a particular item. Remember, voting is generally binary. You're either for it or against it. Quadratic voting opens up the capability to be able to capture a degree of preference for a slate of candidates. We're not going to go into that component of quadratic voting. The component of quadratic voting that we're going to be looking at today is really a binary decision, yes or no, because it works on both frameworks. It works on as a signaling mechanism, but in today's example, we're going to look specifically at binary decisions, yes or no, and how that applies to a minnow versus a whale decision, right? Okay, so by the way, the history of this, so Glenn came up with this concept. I think this was the first paper that he published was in 2014. In 2017, he said, can this mechanism radicalize democracy? And it's in use today in several jurisdictions, been used in Singapore, been used in Kentucky, been used in Lexington, a couple different places that are being using it today. And then along came this guy named Vitalik, and he put together a paper called Quadratic Payments, a Primaries. He started looking into it. And then Vitalik and Glenn and Zoe got together and wrote this paper called The Flexible Design for Public Good Funding. And that turned into something called Gitcoin, which is the organization that I work for. And there's my t-shirt. I just happen to be wearing that today. Okay, so quadratic voting is extremely has a lot of depth to it. There's many different components that you can go through in it. We're not going to do that today. We're only going to be talking about this one component called minnows and whales. So that's where we're going to be discussing it. Now, as I said, if you want access to this information, it's, I think, the 3rd or 4th link of tweet that I just put out about 30 minutes ago. Okay. All right, back to our presentation. Oh, yeah. Sorry. Okay, so let's vote. Now, up for vote this season is, in season 1, the proposal is whales will eat the minnows. That's pretty darn clear, isn't it? So let's say that you're a whale and you've got 2 million tokens. You've got 2 million tokens at $2 a piece, and then you got this little tiny whale over here, or this little tiny minnow. This minnow has 1,000 tokens at $2 a piece. And just to make this more fun, that's you. You are this minnow, right? Which means you're probably thinking, oh, I'm going to get eaten. All right. So let's talk about how quadratic voting can help level the playing field. Now let's look at the traditional token weighted voting, which is the way a majority of our DAOs run today. So you have 2 constituents. You've got the minnow and the whale. The minnow, or the whale, we assume is going to want to eat the minnow. So they're going to say yes. The minnow is going to say, I don't want to be eaten. So they're going to vote no. If they have if the whale has 2 million tokens in hand, they have a voting power of 2 million. So they can vote 2 million times. The minnow has 1,000 tokens. So their voting power is 1,000 tokens. So if you're a minnow and you don't want to be eaten, you have 2 options, and that's it. Option 1 is to go find 2,000 other minnows like you, or come up with $3,998,000 so that you can counteract the whale. That's it. Those are your only 2 options. So you have to go find 2,000 fellow minnows and say, hey guys, on this date, make sure that you vote, make sure that you show up, and let's all try and counteract this one whale. That's not very practical, right? So that goes back to the minuscule problem of you've got 0.08% influence you're going to get eaten, right? And so that's generally the problem of the minnows versus the whales, like using token weighted voting. Let's look at that from a quadratic perspective. Remember, we're just talking about the square root. So all we have to do is we take their total voting power and take the square root of it. So simply, our constituents are again the same, but look at the tokens cast or their tokens cast or voting power. So the whale, instead of getting 2 million votes, they get 1,414 votes. But you have to be fair and you have to take the square root from each one, which means you get the square root of the 1,000 votes as well. So the minnow, he loses votes too. He goes from 1,000 votes down to 31 votes, right? So it's spread across the board. Now let's look at the options. You still only have 2 options, right? However, the options look a little bit different. So option A is go find a bunch of minnows, but the difference is look at how many minnows you have to find. You only have to find 44 minnows to counteract a whale, right? And, or again, the price hasn't changed. You can alternatively go out and find $3,998,000 and buy enough tokens to cross the line. That is in essence how you can take the concept of quadratic voting, apply it to, it's still token weighted. The token weighting is just behaves differently, and the weighting is muted between the whale and the minnow. Okay. Let me stop there. I'm going to do a quick check. I've got participants. I have no questions so far. Ross, I think you're still there. Have any questions popped up on any of the other channels? Sorry, I've just been barreling through this. Ross, because you're still on mute, I'm going to assume there's nothing else there that you need to cover, or there's no other questions that are there. So I'm going to continue moving on, and we're going to wrap it up. We've got about 15 minutes left, and my goal was to try and wrap this thing up and give you about 10 minutes or so for question and answers as we go through this. So, all right, there's minnows versus whale, and an illustration of how quadratic voting levels the playing field between the whales and the minnows. Now, quadratic voting is not, as I said, it is a mechanism. It's not appropriate in all circumstances. If your objective is to drive up your total shareholder revenue or value, or make number go up, it's not appropriate for you. And it's probably not, you probably shouldn't be a DAO, right? But some of the problems associated with token weighted with quadratic voting is transparency. So transparency and information symmetry are required. It is very possible that the minnow voters, if they get a hold of additional information or have additional insight, they have a whole lot more power now, right? And they can have a massive impact. The other piece that is a deal breaker in many cases is something called the proof of personhood, because if you add 10 new minnows to the scenario, you can drastically impact the vote. It means that it's real easy in DAO land to go out and create a bunch of wallets and vote. So you need something to protect against something called the Sybil attack. And the Sybil attack is Mr. Smith in the Matrix. I'm just copying myself 20 times and I'm going to vote 20 different times, even though I'm one person. So you need to have some sort of proof of personhood to say there is one vote, it's one person, and you cannot create 15 versions of yourself to jack the vote up. That's really important. However, excuse me, we do have the technology now inside of even simple tools like Snapshot to be able to put this into place. And we recently at Gitcoin, we did our first quadratic vote. I think it was about a month ago for a panel of stewards for us. So we know that this is working today. And then the other side of that is if you've got a smaller population, it can be sensitive to manipulation. Those are some of the problems around quadratic voting. All right, so it's not all rainbows and buttery rabbits, as I like to say it. Okay, so let's take a look and say, remember the difference between the DAO thinking and quadratic voting. So quadratic voting is an attempt to hold tension between the minnows and the whales. The whales are still whales. They still have a tremendous amount of influence. However, the minnows have hope. And remember, keeping those minnows engaged is what gives us power to the network. If we can keep them engaged, every single one of those nodes is going to make the network more powerful. And that is how we're going to solve climate change or any one of those other complex problems. Okay, one quick last piece. If you want to see quadratic voting and quadratic funding in action today, it's important because today, actually earlier this week, Gitcoin has announced their alpha round, which means we do public funding. That's the objective of Gitcoin, is to build and fund public goods. So today, you can take a little tiny bit of money and go vote on whichever projects you think are the most important. And your little tiny vote is going to have a tremendous weight. So my ask of you guys is, like, if you sat through this presentation, you thought it was helpful, and you're intrigued, you want to see quadratic voting in action, go to Gitcoin today and sign up and make a donation to any one of the 3 rounds that we have going today. And they're all meaningful. For example, the environment round, the open source software round, so building the future of open source, protecting the environment, and then the Ethereum ecosystem round. Each one of those has $330,000 set aside for them. And we know that following this quadratic voting, or this quadratic funding mechanism, we often can take that number times 2 times 3. So that means if there's $1 million set aside for those 3 rounds, we expect that $1 million to go up drastically because of engaged voters like you. There's my sales pitch, and there's my presentation. I'm going to stop here. Are there any questions that I can answer from the audience? And Ross, I hope you're there, who can field questions from any of the other outlets that we're streaming on.
I have a question.
Niels, go for it. Yeah,
Awesome.
Go for it.
So I understand the logic for Gitcoin, like when it's funding, it's like one big decision and you want a large community to get involved. But if you break down an organization, you have organizational decisions made not necessarily at the top organizational level, but you would break it down into sub levels, like classical departments or circles if you follow holographic or sociocratic design principles. So where does this fit in best? Because this, to me, sounds like the classical big shareholder meeting, but then the big stakeholder meeting. And you briefly pointed it out, like if you have smaller teams, then it's more open for manipulation. So where in an organization would you expect this, and where do you draw the line where you say, no, we should use a different type of decision making?
Niels, it's a great question. I'm glad you brought this one up, because it does illustrate one of the disadvantages to quadratic voting. It doesn't work in small populations, right? So in a small population, I would assume, let's say that we're working on a sub-DAO method, right? So you've got your parent DAO and you've got a sub-DAO, right? A group of smaller DAOs which are connected together. If I'm in a group of 7 people, 7 or 5 to 7 people, I would not use quadratic voting, right? But I would also assume I'm probably not using weighted voting either, right? And so in that mechanism, you could use a one person, one vote methodology. Quadratic voting would not be appropriate. To your point, I don't know exactly where the threshold is between appropriate versus non-appropriate, but I would use it as those top level threshold decisions of what is our strategy, what is our mission, what is the budget. When you've got hundreds of voters, when you've got the majority of your population participating in the vote. If it's a team at the team level, if that's a functional level, I wouldn't use it there. Does that answer your question, Niels?
Yep. Thanks.
Thank you for the question. Good. Other questions I can answer? And Ross, I'm going to lean on you to pick up any conversation from any of the other channels which are out there.
Hi there. I've got a quick question. My name is Ram. I'm part of GrowDAO. I missed the first part of this conversation, but if anyone was to try and implement a quadratic governance system, what are some of the best tools out there to utilize? And apologies if this was mentioned in the first half of the session.
Ram, I did not go into it, so that is a great question. So it's funny. It's like there are a number of different mechanisms that can use quadratic voting today. So for example, JokeDAO's got the ability to use quadratic voting. The one that I'm most familiar with right now is really using Snapshot. So Snapshot has the capability. There is, and I think they call them a strategy in place today to use quadratic voting. However, using Snapshot by itself is not enough if you're going to use token-weighted voting, open token-weighted voting, because of that thing that I mentioned, the Sybil attack, right? So if you were to pop open a vote tomorrow and said, today we're going to do we're going to do a quadratic vote, and we have ring fenced, the only people who can vote are the people who voted in the last election, yeah, might be okay. But if you announce next week we're going to have a quadratic vote and it's going to be for this, $5 million proposal, you're going to get rugged. Right. And so the other component that you need, Ram, for that is, yes, you can use you can use Snapshot, but you need some sort of a way to ring fence your voters so that you don't have a bunch of Sibyls come and join you. There's two ways of doing that. One is to develop your list of voters and say, these are the only people who can vote. The other way to do that is a new capability, which Gitcoin actually just introduced recently with Snapshot, is the ability to use something called Passport, or Gitcoin Passport is a tool that you can link. For example, if you have a Facebook account, you go to Gitcoin Passport and you link your Facebook account. You link all your old Web 2 tools like LinkedIn, like Facebook, like Twitter, like there's a bunch of, like, you can put your ENS name in there. So it's a combination of Web 2 and Web 3 hooks that if you put a bunch of those hooks in there, it proves that you're probably a person, because it's a pain in the butt to get a Facebook account. But you add to that Twitter, you add to that to your LinkedIn account. You add many different components to it. It reduces the chance that you are a Sybil. So that combination, along with Snapshot, gives you the ability to execute quadratic voting using your standard Snapshot platform. Ram, did that answer your question?
Yeah, that did. Thanks a lot.
So I'm funny right now because I'm in the process of piloting that right now, and I've got a proposal into ETH Denver to kind of a technical session to walk through how to set that up. I don't know. We'll see. Might see you at ETH Denver doing that presentation.
Yeah, I'll be on the lookout for that one because I'll need that help. So thanks.
Nice, Ram. Feel free to reach out anytime too. Good. Other questions that I can answer for the audience?
Okay, I think I will encourage everybody to ask a question on LinkedIn or any other social network you're using, and we will send your presentation to everybody. But at this moment, it was really a pleasure listening to you, Shawn, and thank you for your coming and contributing to our conference. Thank you very much.
Thanks, folks. Glad you enjoyed it. And if you got questions, go ahead and reach out via the socials. Have a great day and a great weekend.